T-minus 1 minute, 54 seconds and counting. Our status board indicates...
Wednesday, July 16, 1969. Pad 39A, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. A dream of the ages was about to come true. The unbelievable countdown was on.
T-minus 1 minute, 35 seconds on the Apollo mission, the flight to land of the first men on the moon.
At 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the Apollo 11 spacecraft with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard was to be lifted by the flaming power of the 36-story Saturn V rocket into the vacuum of space. There would begin a 500,000-mile odyssey, a voyage which would include, for Armstrong and Aldrin, a day on another world.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus...
Hundreds of thousands of people jammed the roads and beaches miles from the launch site, wanting to be witness to the dramatic first moments of the epic journey. Radio and television carried the event to hundreds of millions more throughout the world. My colleague, CBS News correspondent Reed Collins, described the final seconds as the fulfillment of man's lunar destiny came closer.
We're down to 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. We should see fire. 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition. We have tremendous flame out there. All engines, and we have liftoff. She's rising. She's yawing now to clear the tower. That slight yaw. Now the huge tail is passing the tower. She's lifting up. We have tower clear. We have tower clear. We're beginning to feel the first thunderous roar. I can see her rising now as she's going up straight into the roll program, which she should be completing. We should expect to hear from the astronauts as this spit of land is beginning to shake with the power of it as it goes through a slight wisp of cloud.
Within a few moments, the staccato roar of 7.5 million pounds of thrust faded away. What millions had paused to watch was quickly out of sight. 12 minutes later, the first and second stages of the launch vehicle burned out. Apollo 11 was in orbit around the Earth. There was time now to describe the takeoff.
Houston, Apollo 11 and Saturn gave us a magnificent ride. We have no complaints with any of the three stages on that ride. It was beautiful.
Roger, 11, we'll pass that on, and it certainly looks like you're well on your way now.
Still attached to the Apollo 11 spacecraft was the Saturn's third stage rocket, containing the Eagle, the lunar module, the craft that would land on the moon. If all systems checked out during the first orbit of Earth, ground controllers at the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston would give the go for TLI, Trans-Lunar Injection, permission to start the third stage engine again, 227,000 pounds of thrust to increase the speed of Apollo 11, to drive it into a moon-bound path.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over.
Apollo 11, thank you.
The next job was to separate the Apollo 11 command module, code-named the Columbia, from the third stage rocket, then to turn Columbia around and join up with Eagle, to pull it free from the third stage. When this undocking was done, the third stage was fired once again to send it out of the way. Now Columbia and Eagle, united together as Apollo 11, began to coast out of Earth's gravity toward the invisible spot in space where the moon would be 3 days later. What was the remarkable string of events which had brought our nation to the eve of this great adventure? October 4th, 1957, the space shot heard around the world. While we were leisurely getting the Vanguard satellite with its 20-pound payload ready for launch, the Russians put the 184-pound Sputnik 1 into orbit. The beeping voice of this Soviet space spectacular delighted the world, but at home there was shock. If the Russians could place this much weight in orbit, their rockets were obviously more powerful than ours, and so too, one assumed, their missiles. 15 months later, one of our answers to the Soviets was to launch a talking satellite.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space.
The message of President Eisenhower was an attempt to regain some of our lost prestige, but the Russian lead was widening. 2 weeks later, they had another shocker.
This is Radio Moscow, and here is the news.
The USSR today launched a rocket towards the moon. It has entered its trajectory according to program, and first reports indicate that the last step has received the required second cosmic speed.
With the space gap getting larger, the decision was made to let former German rocket scientist Dr. Werner von Braun go ahead with plans to develop the first of the Saturn rockets. At the same time, the decision also was made to go ahead with the Mercury program, a program to put one-man capsules in space for short orbital flights. In late 1959, Dr. von Braun pleaded for a go-ahead for more ambitious steps in space.
I'm not pessimistic about our present stature in the space business. I'm just plainly dissatisfied. We have been told that the hammer and sickle flag has now been planted on the moon, and we have no reason to doubt it. I would not be at all surprised to be hearing a human voice from outer space that will have an unmistakable Russian accent.
April 12, 1961 was another date we would remember on our way to the moon. Yuri Gagarin's 89-minute flight in orbit around the Earth only seemed to place us even further behind. And then on May 5th, 1961, we finally had something to shout about. Our spirits soared with Alan Shepard when he became the first American astronaut to sit atop a rocket and blast off on a suborbital flight 302 miles out into the Atlantic.
Cabin pressure is holding at 5.5. 5G. 5G. Everything looks A-okay here. Periscope is coming out. Periscope coming out. On the periscope. What on the periscope now. Beautiful view. Cloud cover over Florida. 3 to 4 tenths near the eastern coast. Obscures up to Hatteras. Is reporting the cloud coverage. Just about what he saw on the weather map. Everything looks A-okay. Present position is right on the button. Looks excellent. Retro 1. Retro 1 fired. Very smooth. Roger, roger. Looks like we got a beautiful mission going here.
Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson, as vice president under John Kennedy, was putting together a recommendation that would start this nation on the great moon quest.
On April the 29th, I sent him a 5.5-page memorandum, which had unanimously been agreed upon by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, leaders in the business life of this country, Mr. Brown, George Brown, Dr. Frank Stanton, and Donald Cook of American Electric Power, as well as the leaders of senators, Senator Kerr, who was the chairman of the Space Committee, Senator Bridges, and Senator Saltonstall, and other leaders, in which we all unanimously recommended certain things. And one of the paragraphs in that memorandum said that we felt that we could have a good chance, notwithstanding the Soviet exploits up to that time, of taking leadership in the space field and sending a man to the moon and bringing him back in this decade.
May 25th, 1961. After 126 days in office and acting on the recommendation of the Johnson-headed Space Council, John Fitzgerald Kennedy addressed the Congress of the United States.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary, but the facts of the matter are that we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment. Recognizing the head start obtained by the Soviets with their large rocket engines, which gives them many months of lead time, and recognizing the likelihood that they will exploit this lead for some time to come in still more impressive successes, we nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own. For while we cannot guarantee that we shall one day be first, we can guarantee that any failure to make this effort will make us lost. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation. I believe we should go to the moon.
And thus the United States was committed to put its money and its prestige on the line in a race with the Soviet Union to put the first man on the moon. It was a long way to go, but a beginning was made on February 20th, 1962, when John Glenn Jr. took his Friendship 7 into space and into orbit.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger, turnaround has started. Capsule turning around, and I could see the booster during turnaround just a couple of 100 yards behind me. It was beautiful. Roger, 7. You have a go. At least 7 orbits. Roger.
The one-man Mercury program yielded to the two-man Gemini program. Now, with these more sophisticated spaceships, we were ready to try the world's first rendezvous in space. Walter Schirra and Tom Stafford, flying Gemini 6, found in space Frank Borman and James Lovell, flying Gemini 7, and brought their craft within feet of touching.
Right now, 6 is about 10 feet above and to the left of 7. We're just flying nose to nose, approximately 15 feet apart.
Gemini 7, are you able to see in the windows of 6 very easily and vice versa?
Roger, 7 here. I hope he had his movie camera on at 6. Be the first acrobatic stunt in space.
Yep. You know, you guys are becoming famous.
For what, Frank?
For rendezvousing and doing all these good things.
Very good.
The space rendezvous was vital to the American effort to reach the moon.
We ask ourselves the question, how can we use rendezvous to better perform the lunar mission and actually make a landing?
Dr. John C. Hubolt was an aerodynamicist at the Langley Research Center in Virginia at the time the decision was being made on how to get to the lunar surface and back.
Immediately I saw the benefits to be derived out of using rendezvous, and I can liken it to the situation of you're on the way to the moon in some living room or some quarters, and you get there and you ask yourself, why should I take my whole living room down to the surface? Surely there would be a lot of energy or a lot of fuel required to land the whole living room, then take it back up for the return to Earth. So the thought simply occurred to me, why not just, when you get to the vicinity of the moon, put the living room in an orbit around the moon and then descend to the moon's surface with a small little lander. And I made a few calculations on the back of the envelope to more or less check my intuitive feelings and found out that, lo and behold, you could do the job with a much smaller booster requirement initially than any other way. And immediately it struck me that this is a quicker, faster, and much safer way of doing the whole job.
Hubolt had to buck the system to get his ideas approved, but eventually his plan was considered as the most practical way of achieving success. There also were others whose contributions to travel in space always would be remembered. Along with Newton and Kepler, Russia's Tsiolkovsky, Germany's Oberth, there was the American rocket pioneer Dr. Robert Goddard. His widow remembers the day in 1926 when Dr. Goddard launched the world's first liquid fuel rocket.
One day he came home with his eyes just glowing, and he said, oh, the rocket lifted in it more than its own weight for so many seconds. And I looked and said, oh, well, that's nice. He says, you know, we're going to be able to take it out and try it in a little while now. There was a very simple framework made out of piping, and then this fragile little aluminum rocket was sitting inside. And when they were ready, my husband pressed a button and the firing took place. This white flame came out very, very bright and pointed. Very similar to what you would see with a welding torch if you have watched them working. So bright you don't want to look at it. very long. It hesitated, just as they do at Cape Kennedy now, and that heartbreaking few seconds when it isn't sure it can make it. But then it lifted off as lightly as a ballet dancer and went up and over. It went up about 60 feet and then tilted and landed about 180 feet from the launching place. It has been likened to the Wright brothers' first plane, a very fragile piece of mechanism, but it worked.
By early 1967, the hardware for the Apollo missions finally was ready. It was to be subject to the same methodic testing in space which had gone into the earlier Gemini missions. But perhaps we were moving too fast. The evening of January 27th.
Astronauts Virgil I. Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were killed tonight in a flash fire during test of the Apollo Saturn 204 vehicle at Cape Kennedy Air Force Station.
The tragedy meant that every wire, every switch, every part of the Apollo would be examined and rebuilt, if necessary, to ensure safety. And while we redesigned and rebuilt, it seemed we were going to lose the lead we had opened up on the Russians in the race to the moon. Finally, the new Apollos were ready for test again, first in Earth orbit, and then in the historic flight of Apollo 8 around the moon during the Christmas of 1968.
The crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Following Apollo 8 came the successful flights of Apollos 9 and 10 to prove that the lunar module, the great untried element of our program, would work in space and in the environment of the moon. And then we were ready for the flight of Apollo 11, the one to get us to the lunar surface. 8 years and $24 billion later, the commander of Apollo 11, 38-year-old Neil Armstrong of Wapakoneta, Ohio, and the only civilian astronaut, thought we were ready to go.
After a decade of planning and hard work, we're willing and ready to attempt to achieve our national goal. This is possible because very many Americans across the nation have dedicated themselves to quality, craftsmanship, and ingenuity. We're dependent, too, on the successes of the previous flights. The unmanned flights and the manned flights, Apollos 7, 8, 9, and 10, whose crews have done a magnificent job of preparing the way for us. I'm sure this American ingenuity and American craftsmanship has given us the best equipment that can be made available. And we're very happy to be ready to fly.
Shortly before the launch of Apollo 11, the Russians were still to be heard from, announcing that Luna 15, an unmanned spaceship, was on its way to the moon. There was speculation the Russians planned to land, scoop up lunar soil, and bring the sample back to Earth before Apollo 11 could return. We could only wait to find out. But even so, our joy was not diminished in the forthcoming accomplishment of Apollo 11. A very special day was to be set aside for the astronauts.
as the astronauts go where man has never gone before, as they attempt what man has never tried, we on Earth will want as one people to be with them in spirit, to share the glory and the wonder, and to support them with prayers that all will go well. In order that as many as possible can have the opportunity to share as fully as possible in this surpassing occasion, I have proclaimed Monday, July 21, 1969, to be a national day of participation.